The strangest deals in America are not signed in boardrooms. They are signed in silence. That was the sentence Ethan Caldwell would remember years later. Though on the night everything began, he had no idea a quiet decision would change the course of two lives. The room was hidden on the top floor of a private club overlooking Manhattan, where the windows stretched from polished marble floor to ceiling glass, and the city lights below shimmered like scattered gold coins across the Hudson. It was late enough that the traffic had thinned and the air carried that particular stillness New York only revealed after midnight. Ethan Caldwell stood near the window, tall and composed, his charcoal suit tailored with the quiet precision that came with wealth measured in billions rather than millions. At 38, he had already built Caldwell Dynamics into one of the fastest rising technology firms in the country, the kind of company mentioned on financial news every morning before the stock market opened. Investors described him as disciplined, efficient, impossible to surprise. What they did not know was that Ethan disliked nights like this. Private meetings, quiet arrangements, deals that existed in the shadows instead of spreadsheets. Across the long table sat a man who looked like he had not slept properly in days. His name was Marcus Carter, a name that once carried some respect in small construction circles across New Jersey, though tonight the man looked worn down by something heavier than exhaustion. His jacket hung slightly loose on his shoulders, and his hands kept rubbing together like someone trying to warm them in cold weather. The room smelled faintly of leather and espresso. No one else spoke. The two lawyers who had arranged the meeting waited silently near the door, their presence professional and distant, as if they were witnessing a contract for property rather than a conversation about a human life. Marcus Carter cleared his throat once, then again, before finally forcing the words out. "You're the only man who said yes." Ethan did not immediately answer. Instead, he glanced once toward the city, then back to the man sitting across from him. "I said I would consider it," Ethan replied evenly. "There's a difference." Marcus nodded quickly as if afraid the opportunity might vanish if he moved too slowly. "Consider it, yes. But you're still here. That means something." His voice trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it behind a nervous smile that never fully formed. On the table between them sat a folder, thin but heavy with implication. Inside were documents that had taken 3 weeks of negotiations to assemble, agreements written in careful legal language that avoided the harshest interpretation of what this meeting truly represented. Ethan opened the folder slowly. He had read every page already, of course. Billionaires rarely walked into rooms unprepared. Still, he let his eyes pass once more over the lines as if searching for something different than what he had already seen. The final page carried the essential arrangement. Financial relief for Marcus Carter's debts. Housing security for the next 10 years. A clean legal framework that ensured no future claims. And in return, Marcus Carter's daughter would enter into a contractual marriage with Ethan Caldwell for a period defined by terms that the lawyers described as mutually protective. Ethan closed the folder again. Silence settled over the room like dust. "Does she know?" Ethan asked quietly. Marcus's eyes flickered toward the window and then back to the table. "She knows enough." That was not an answer. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the man in front of him. Years of negotiation had taught him how to read hesitation in the smallest gestures. Marcus Carter was not a cruel man. Desperate perhaps, foolish perhaps, but not cruel. Which made the situation stranger, not simpler. "Enough means what?" Ethan asked. Marcus exhaled slowly. "She knows this is the only way out." Ethan watched him carefully. Outside the window, a ferry moved slowly along the river, its lights drifting through the dark water like floating lanterns. Somewhere far below, a siren echoed through the city streets before fading again into the distance. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice softer now. "Her name is Nia." The way he said it carried a weight that made the room feel smaller. Ethan nodded once. "And Nia Carter agreed to this arrangement herself." It was phrased as a statement, but carried the tone of a question. Marcus hesitated only a fraction of a second. "She understands what it means." That pause told Ethan more than the words did. He did not push further. Not yet. Instead, he closed the folder and rested his hands calmly on the table. "I will meet her first," Ethan said. Marcus looked surprised, as though that had not been part of the plan. "You don't have to. Everything's already prepared." "Nevertheless," Ethan replied, "I will meet her." The lawyers near the door exchanged a quick glance, but said nothing. Marcus Carter shifted in his seat, clearly uncertain. "She's waiting downstairs," he admitted finally. Ethan's expression did not change, though something inside him tightened slightly in a way he did not immediately recognize. "Then bring her up." 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened with a quiet chime that seemed louder than it should have in the stillness of the hallway. The footsteps that followed were light but steady. Ethan remained seated as the door to the private room opened again. The first thing he noticed was not fear. That surprised him. After everything he had read in the documents, he expected someone nervous, someone angry, someone desperate to escape the situation unfolding around her. Instead, the young woman who stepped into the room carried herself with an unusual calm. Nia Carter stood near the doorway for a moment before walking forward beside her father. She wore a simple dark blue dress that reached just below her knees, the kind of dress someone might wear to a quiet dinner rather than a meeting that could alter the direction of her life. Her posture was straight, her shoulders relaxed. She did not look down at the floor the way people often did in rooms filled with wealth and authority. She looked directly at Ethan Caldwell. Her eyes were steady, not defiant, not pleading, simply steady. The silence stretched long enough that one of the lawyers shifted his weight awkwardly near the door. Ethan studied her carefully. She was younger than he expected, though there was a composure in the way she stood that suggested experience had shaped her earlier than most people her age. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, fingers relaxed rather than clenched. Marcus cleared his throat again. "This is my daughter." Nia did not look at him. She continued looking at Ethan instead. "I know who he is," she said quietly. Her voice carried across the room with surprising clarity. It was not loud, but it did not need to be. Ethan noticed something else then. There were no tears. No trembling. Whatever conversation had happened before she entered this building had already resolved something inside her. He stood slowly. From his chair. In a room filled with people who believed they understood power, the moment felt strangely balanced, as if the advantage did not belong entirely to the billionaire standing in front of the skyline. Ethan extended his hand politely. "Ethan Caldwell." Nia looked at his hand for a moment before shaking it once. Her grip was firm but brief. "Nia Carter." Their eyes met again. In that instant, Ethan realized something unexpected. This woman did not look like someone who believed she had been sold. She looked like someone who had made a decision. The silence after their handshake did not feel uncomfortable. It felt deliberate, like two people studying a chessboard before the first move. Ethan Caldwell released Nia Carter's hand and gestured toward the chair across the long marble table. "Please sit." His voice remained calm, the same tone he used during negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But this moment felt strangely different from any boardroom discussion he had ever led. Nia sat without hesitation, smoothing the edge of her dress as she did. Marcus Carter remained standing for a moment before slowly lowering himself into the seat beside her, his posture slightly hunched as though the weight of the situation had settled across his shoulders. The lawyers remained near the door, silent observers in a room that suddenly felt less like a business meeting and more like the beginning of something neither contract nor calculation could fully define. Ethan remained standing for a moment longer before walking to the window. From this height, the city stretched endlessly, a quiet ocean of glass towers and late-night headlights moving through avenues like veins of light. He had built his empire inside that skyline. Every building represented a deal, a partnership, a negotiation carefully controlled. Yet tonight the rules felt less clear. After a moment, he turned back toward the table. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice even. "I believe we should speak without intermediaries." The two lawyers understood immediately. One of them nodded and stepped outside the room, the other following quietly behind. The door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo longer than expected. Now only 3 people remained. Ethan returned to his seat slowly and folded his hands together. "I prefer honesty in arrangements like this," he said. "It prevents unnecessary misunderstandings later." Marcus Carter shifted uneasily beside his daughter. But Nia did not move. She simply looked at Ethan with that same steady expression he had noticed the moment she entered the room. "You want to know why I agreed?" she said. It was not phrased as a question. Ethan nodded once. "Yes." Marcus opened his mouth as though he might interrupt, but Nia raised one hand slightly without looking at him. The gesture was small, almost gentle, yet it carried the quiet authority of someone who had already decided to speak for herself. My father told you this was the only way to solve his problem, she continued calmly. That is true. Her voice remained clear and controlled. But that is not the only reason I came here tonight. Ethan watched her carefully. Most negotiations he experienced involved people trying to hide something. Nia Carter did not appear to be hiding anything. If anything, she looked prepared to say exactly what needed to be said. Then tell me the rest, Ethan said. Nia took a slow breath, not nervous but measured. My father's debts are real, she said. The bank will take the house in 2 months. My younger brother will have to leave school if that happens. My mother passed away 3 years ago, so there is no one else left to help us. Marcus lowered his head slightly, his hands clasped tightly together. Ethan glanced at him briefly before returning his attention to Nia. And you believe entering this arrangement will solve those problems? Nia nodded once. Yes. The word hung quietly in the air. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. Most people in your position would try to negotiate better terms, he said thoughtfully, or refuse entirely. Nia gave a small smile that did not reach her eyes. Most people are not watching their family lose everything. The honesty in her tone made the room feel heavier. Ethan had spent his career surrounded by ambition and strategy. Desperation was different. Desperation did not calculate long-term outcomes. It simply searched for survival. Yet the woman sitting across from him did not look desperate. She looked resolved. You understand what the contract requires, Ethan said carefully. Yes. You would live in my residence. Yes. Public appearances may be required to maintain the credibility of the agreement. Nia nodded again. Yes. Ethan studied her for another moment. And you are comfortable with that? Nia tilted her head slightly, considering the word comfortable as though it belonged to someone else's life. Comfortable is not the correct word, she said quietly. But I am prepared. Marcus shifted again beside her, his voice low. Nia, you do not have to sound so, he struggled to find the word. Nia finished it for him. Practical. She turned to him briefly then. Someone has to be. The remark was not cruel. It was simply true. Marcus looked down at the table again, his shoulders sinking slightly. Ethan observed the exchange silently. Something about the dynamic between them felt familiar. Not because he had experienced it personally, but because he had seen it in countless boardrooms where one person carried the responsibility others could not handle. Responsibility changed people. It sharpened them. It forced clarity earlier than life should require. Nia turned back toward Ethan. There is something you should understand before you decide whether to continue, she said. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. Go on. I did not come here to be rescued, she said. And I did not come here expecting kindness. The statement was delivered calmly, almost academically, but it landed with surprising force. Ethan found himself leaning slightly forward in his chair. Then what did you come here expecting? Nia met his eyes directly. An agreement. The word hung in the air between them. Outside the window, a helicopter crossed the sky slowly, its red lights blinking against the darkness above Manhattan. Ethan had negotiated thousands of agreements in his life. Yet hearing the word spoken like this, without illusion or emotion attached to it, made the situation feel strangely balanced. You are very direct, he said after a moment. I learned early that pretending does not solve real problems, Nia replied. Marcus finally looked up again, his voice quiet. She always has been like that. Ethan noticed the pride hidden inside the regret in the man's voice. For a moment the billionaire said nothing. Instead he looked down at the folder still resting on the table. The papers inside represented a solution that had originally seemed simple. A legal arrangement. A financial exchange. A clean conclusion. Yet now the presence of the woman sitting across from him complicated the clarity of those pages. Ethan lifted the folder slowly and slid it across the table toward Nia. You should read it yourself, he said. Nia opened it without hesitation. Her eyes moved across the pages carefully, line by line. The room remained silent except for the faint rustle of paper. After several minutes, she closed the folder again. The terms are clear, she said. Ethan nodded slightly. And Nia rested her hands lightly on the table. I will accept them. Marcus inhaled sharply beside her, as though the finality of the moment had only now become real. Ethan looked at Nia carefully. Before you sign anything, he said slowly, there is one more thing you should know. Nia raised her eyes again. What is that? Ethan's voice remained calm, but something quieter moved beneath the surface now, something even he had not expected before tonight. "If this agreement happens," he said, "you will not be treated like property." Nia studied him for a moment, measuring the sincerity behind the statement. Then she said something that surprised him. "Good." She paused briefly before adding, "Because I am not." The room remained quiet after Nia Carter's final words, the kind of silence that carried more meaning than any argument could. Ethan Caldwell studied her carefully from across the table, his expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. In his world, confidence usually arrived wrapped in ambition, sharpened by people who wanted something from him. But the confidence in Nia's voice felt different. It did not sound like someone asking for opportunity. It sounded like someone protecting dignity. Outside the tall windows, the lights of Manhattan glowed softly against the dark sky, and for a moment the billionaire found himself thinking about how strange the evening had become. 3 hours earlier he expected nothing more than a simple agreement. Yet now the air in the room felt heavier, like the beginning of a story he had not planned to enter. Ethan rested his hands on the table again and spoke slowly. "Then we understand each other." Nia nodded once. "Yes." Marcus Carter shifted uneasily beside his daughter, glancing from one of them to the other, as if he could sense the balance of power in the room, changing in a way he could not quite explain. He cleared his throat. "If everything is agreed, then perhaps we should finish the paperwork." The words sounded rushed, almost hopeful, as though completing the process quickly might prevent anyone from reconsidering. Ethan did not immediately respond. Instead, he reached for the folder again and turned it slightly toward Nia. The pen resting beside it gleamed under the warm light above the table. For most people, the act of signing would have felt like a final moment of surrender. Yet Nia did not hesitate. She picked up the pen calmly and studied the final page once more. Marcus watched her closely, his fingers pressed tightly together. Ethan remained still, observing both of them with the quiet patience of someone used to seeing negotiations unfold slowly. After a moment, Nia placed the pen down again without signing. "There is one thing missing," she said. Marcus blinked in confusion. "Missing?" Nia turned the last page back toward Ethan and tapped lightly near the bottom of the document. "The timeline." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "The agreement states 2 years. "Yes," Nia replied. "But it does not explain what happens after those 2 years. The question hung in the room with unexpected weight. Ethan had negotiated hundreds of contracts in his career, yet few people ever asked about the ending before the beginning. He rested his elbows lightly on the table. "After 2 years the arrangement ends," he said calmly. "Financial support for your family remains intact. You return to your own life." Nia listened carefully. "And your life continues unchanged." Ethan tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the accuracy of her observation. "More or less." Nia considered that for a moment. Her expression remained thoughtful rather than suspicious. "Then I have one request." Marcus shifted nervously again. "Nia, you do not need to negotiate. Everything we asked for is already here." She looked at him gently. "I am not negotiating for money." Ethan watched her with quiet curiosity. "What are you negotiating for?" Nia folded her hands together on the table. "Clarity." The word was simple, but carried unusual strength. Ethan nodded slowly. "Explain." Nia spoke with the same steady tone she had used since entering the room. "If this arrangement lasts 2 years, then I want the freedom to rebuild my own life during that time. Education, work, independence. I do not want to leave this agreement the same person who entered it." Marcus stared at her in surprise. Ethan remained silent for a moment, studying the seriousness behind her words. Many people would have asked for luxury or security. Nia Carter was asking for opportunity. "You want to use the time to prepare your future," Ethan said. "Yes." Her answer came immediately. "I will fulfill every responsibility written in this contract. Public appearances, social events, whatever is required to maintain your reputation. But I do not want to walk away from 2 years of my life with nothing except a memory." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. The honesty in her request made the situation feel unexpectedly balanced again. He realized something then that none of the lawyers had anticipated when they drafted the agreement. Nia Carter was not entering this arrangement to survive. She was entering it to transform her circumstances. The difference mattered more than the contract itself. Marcus rubbed his forehead slowly. "Nia, this man is already helping us more than we deserve." She turned to him gently. "I know." Then she looked back at Ethan. But help should create strength, not dependence. The words settled in the air with quiet authority. Ethan found himself nodding before he even fully considered the response. You are right, he said. Marcus looked between them again, still struggling to understand how the conversation had shifted away from the simple transaction he originally imagined. Ethan reached for the pen and added a short handwritten note beneath the final clause of the contract. His handwriting was precise and deliberate. When he finished, he slid the document back toward Nia. You will have access to any education program you choose, he said calmly. And you will be free to pursue professional work if it does not conflict with the public obligations described here. Nia read the new line carefully. After a moment, she looked up again. Thank you. Ethan shrugged slightly. It is a reasonable request. Marcus exhaled slowly as though a weight had lifted from his chest. For the first time that evening, the tension in his shoulders seemed to soften slightly. Nia picked up the pen again. This time she signed her name without hesitation. The ink dried quickly against the thick paper. Ethan watched the signature appear on the page, aware that the simple motion marked the beginning of something far more complicated than either of them had predicted. Nia slid the folder back toward him. It is done. Ethan signed his own name beneath hers with the same calm precision he used for every business deal. Yet as he closed the folder, he realized the feeling in the room was nothing like the usual conclusion of a transaction. Marcus stood quickly, relief visible on his face. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I cannot express how grateful I am. Ethan nodded politely, but his attention remained on Nia. She had not stood yet. Instead, she remained seated, looking out the window toward the glowing skyline beyond the glass. The city lights reflected softly in her eyes. Ethan followed her gaze for a moment before speaking again. You will move into the residence tomorrow, he said. Nia nodded once. I understand. Marcus hesitated. Tomorrow. Ethan turned to him calmly. Your financial situation will be resolved immediately. The sooner the arrangement begins, the sooner stability returns to your family. Marcus looked at his daughter uncertainly. Nia, are you comfortable with that? She rose slowly from her chair. Comfortable is still not the correct word. Then she met Ethan's eyes again, with that same steady composure that had caught his attention the moment she entered the room. But I am ready. For a moment, the three of them stood together in silence. Outside the window, the city moved endlessly, unaware that a decision made on the top floor of a quiet building had just altered the course of 3 different lives. Morning arrived quietly over the Hudson River, pale sunlight spreading across the glass towers of Manhattan as the city began another restless day. Nia Carter stood beside the window of her small bedroom at her family's house in Newark, watching the distant skyline glow gold under the rising sun. The night before felt strangely unreal now, like a conversation that had happened in someone else's life. Yet the contract resting inside her bag on the chair behind her was proof that it had all been real. 2 years. 2 years living in the world of Ethan Caldwell. 2 years that would determine whether the decision she made had saved her family or simply changed the shape of her sacrifices. Downstairs, she could hear quiet movement in the kitchen. Her younger brother Daniel was already awake, the sound of cereal pouring into a bowl echoing faintly through the hallway. Daniel was 16 and taller than she remembered him being just a year ago, his voice beginning to deepen as he stepped toward adulthood without fully understanding the fragile ground beneath their family. Nia stepped away from the window and walked downstairs. Daniel looked up from the table when she entered, spoon halfway to his mouth. You are up early, he said. She smiled gently and poured herself a glass of water. Big day. Daniel frowned slightly. Dad said you were meeting someone important last night. Nia leaned against the counter and looked at him for a moment. Daniel had their mother's eyes, bright and curious, always searching for explanations. She wondered how much he truly understood about the tension that had lived in their home for the past year. I did, she said carefully. And the meeting solved the problem with the house. Daniel lowered his spoon slowly. You mean the bank? Nia nodded once. Yes. Relief spread across his face so quickly it almost hurt to see. So we do not have to move? No, she said softly. You do not. Daniel grinned and leaned back in his chair. I knew you would fix it. The confidence in his voice was simple and unquestioned, the kind of trust only younger siblings gave without hesitation. Nia smiled but did not answer immediately. She simply watched him finish his breakfast, listening to the quiet rhythm of the morning. Marcus Carter entered the kitchen a few minutes later, his expression still carrying the exhaustion of the previous night. When he saw Nia, he hesitated slightly, as though uncertain how to begin a conversation that had already changed everything between them. Daniel jumped up immediately. "Dad, Nia says we are not losing the house." Marcus nodded slowly. "That is right." Daniel laughed and grabbed his backpack from the chair. "I am telling Coach after school. He kept saying I might have to switch districts." He hurried out the door without noticing the heavy silence that settled behind him. When the door closed, Marcus leaned against the table and looked at his daughter. "You did not have to reassure him like that," he said quietly. Nia folded her arms loosely. "He deserved to know something good this morning." Marcus rubbed his hands together, a habit he seemed unable to break when nerves took hold of him. "I still cannot believe you agreed to it so easily." Nia tilted her head slightly. "It was not easy. You signed the contract without hesitation." She looked at him steadily. "Because hesitation would not have changed the outcome." Marcus looked down at the floor for a moment. "I never imagined my mistakes would lead to something like this." Nia walked toward the door and picked up her bag. "We cannot change what already happened." Marcus watched her quietly. "You are leaving today." It was not a question. "Yes. And you will live with him." Nia nodded once. Marcus exhaled slowly. "I wish there had been another way." She looked at him with calm acceptance rather than anger. "So do I." The silence that followed carried the complicated weight of family loyalty and regret. After a moment, Marcus reached into his pocket and placed a small photograph on the table. It showed their family from several years earlier, standing together at the Jersey Shore on a bright summer afternoon. Their mother stood in the middle, laughing with wind blowing through her hair. "Your mother always believed you would change the world somehow," Marcus said softly. Nia looked at the photograph for a moment before sliding it carefully into her bag. "Maybe this is how that begins." An hour later, a black sedan waited outside the house. The driver stood beside the open rear door, dressed in a dark suit with the quiet professionalism that came from working for one of the most powerful men in the country. Nia hugged her father once before stepping toward the car. Marcus held her a moment longer than expected. "If anything feels wrong, you come home immediately," he said. "This agreement does not control your entire life." Nia nodded gently. "I know." She stepped into the car, and the door closed softly behind her. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, she watched the small house grow smaller in the rear window. The streets of Newark gradually gave way to the wide bridges leading toward Manhattan. Traffic thickened as the city rose ahead of them, glass towers shining under the bright morning sky. The driver remained silent for most of the trip until they crossed into the Upper East Side. "We will arrive in 2 minutes," he said politely. Nia looked out the window as the car turned onto a quiet tree-lined avenue. The buildings here looked different from the crowded neighborhoods she knew. Tall iron gates guarded private driveways, and uniformed doormen stood beside polished entrances as though they were guardians of another world. The sedan slowed before a large townhouse set slightly back from the street. The building rose 5 stories high, its pale stone exterior glowing warmly in the sunlight. The driver stepped out and opened the door for her. "Welcome to the Caldwell residence." Nia stepped onto the sidewalk and looked up at the building. It was not the cold glass tower she had expected, but something older and quieter, the kind of place where decisions were made behind closed doors rather than broadcast to the public. Before she could study it further, the front door opened. Ethan Caldwell stood in the entrance, dressed simply in a white shirt and dark trousers, his expression calm but attentive. He walked down the steps toward her. "Good morning, Miss Carter." Nia met his gaze without hesitation. "Good morning." Ethan glanced briefly at the car driving away before turning back toward her. "I hope the trip was comfortable." It was. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the soft morning light. The quiet street around them felt almost peaceful compared to the restless energy of the city beyond. Ethan finally gestured toward the open doorway behind him. "Your room is prepared," he said. Nia followed him up the steps and into the house. The interior was elegant but surprisingly warm, filled with bookshelves and tall windows that allowed sunlight to spill across polished wood floors. It did not feel like a place designed for display. It felt lived in. Ethan led her through a hallway and up a curved staircase. "There are only a few expectations we should clarify today," he said as they walked. "Public appearances will begin next month. Until then, you are free to settle in." Nia nodded quietly, observing the house around her. Ethan stopped outside a large bedroom door and opened it. This will be your space. The room overlooked a quiet garden behind the townhouse. Sunlight filtered through tall trees, painting soft shadows across the floor. Nia stepped inside slowly. After a moment, she turned back toward Ethan. Thank you. Ethan studied her expression carefully. You seem calmer than most people would be in your situation. Nia looked out the window toward the garden. Calm does not mean comfortable. Ethan considered that for a moment. Then what does it mean? Nia rested her hand lightly on the windowsill, watching the leaves move gently in the breeze. It means I decided not to be afraid. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the woman standing in the quiet room of his home and realized something unexpected had already begun to change. The quiet garden outside the window swayed gently in the late morning breeze, and for a long moment Nia Carter simply stood there absorbing the unfamiliar stillness of the room. The house felt different from what she imagined a billionaire's residence would be. It was elegant, yes, but not cold. Books lined the shelves along one wall, and a large wooden desk sat near the window as though someone actually used the room for thinking rather than display. Ethan Caldwell remained near the doorway, watching her with a calm expression that revealed little but suggested careful observation. After a moment he spoke again. The house staff will introduce themselves later today, he said. They are used to discretion. Nia nodded slightly without turning from the window. I appreciate that. Ethan studied the way she held herself, her posture composed even in unfamiliar surroundings. Most people he met in his world carried visible reactions when they stepped into his life for the first time. Awe, nervousness, excitement, sometimes resentment. Nia carried none of those things. Instead, she seemed to be measuring the space quietly, as if deciding how she would exist inside it. Ethan stepped into the room fully and rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair. There is something else you should know, he said. Nia turned slightly toward him. What is that? This arrangement will attract attention eventually, he explained. The public knows very little about my private life. When they see us together, questions will appear. Nia considered that calmly. Questions do not frighten me. Ethan almost smiled at the simplicity of the statement. Most people in my position spend years trying to avoid them. Nia walked slowly across the room, running her fingertips lightly across the edge of the desk as she passed. Avoiding questions does not remove them. It only delays them. Ethan watched her thoughtfully. You speak like someone who has been answering difficult questions for a long time. Nia paused near the bookshelf and scanned the titles for a moment before responding. When your family struggles financially, people always ask why. Teachers ask. Neighbors ask. Even relatives ask. Eventually you learn that the only useful response is honesty. Ethan folded his arms loosely. And what answer did you usually give? Nia selected one of the books at random and examined the cover before, placing it back exactly where she found it. That sometimes good people make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes become someone else's responsibility. The words carried no bitterness, only quiet recognition. Ethan felt something shift slightly in his thoughts. For most of his life, he had built careful distance between his success and the struggles of ordinary families. Listening to Nia describe it so plainly made the gap feel less theoretical. He glanced toward the window where sunlight filtered through the garden trees. You do not seem angry with your father. Nia looked toward the door where Ethan stood. Anger would not change what already happened, but it might make the situation easier to accept. She shook her head gently. No, it would only make it heavier. The calm wisdom in her voice surprised him again. Ethan cleared his throat lightly and changed the subject. There is a small library on the second floor you may use whenever you like. My schedule is often unpredictable, so you will have a great deal of independence in the house. Nia nodded. That is helpful. You may also begin exploring educational programs immediately if you wish. My assistant can help with the process. Nia looked genuinely thoughtful now. I was hoping to finish my degree in business administration. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. You were studying business. Part-time, she said. I had to work most evenings. Ethan glanced toward the desk again. That explains your negotiation skills. Nia smiled faintly. Living with limited resources forces people to learn efficiency. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet rhythm of the house filled the space between their words. Somewhere downstairs, a door closed softly, and distant footsteps crossed the hallway. Ethan finally straightened and walked toward the window, standing beside her, but leaving enough space to maintain the respectful distance they had both established since the night before. From here the garden looked peaceful, a small square of green hidden behind tall brick walls. "You should know something about my life as well," he said after a moment. Nia turned slightly to listen. Ethan rested his hands loosely in his pockets. "Most people assume wealth creates freedom," he said. "In many ways it does. But it also creates constant observation. Every decision becomes a headline if someone chooses to write about it." Nia watched him carefully. "And you believe our agreement will eventually become one of those headlines?" Ethan nodded once. "Possibly." Nia did not seem alarmed by the idea. Instead, she asked quietly, "Does that concern you?" Ethan looked toward the city skyline visible above the garden wall. "It used to concern me more." "What changed?" Ethan considered the question longer than expected. Finally, he answered simply, "Experience." Nia nodded slowly as though that explanation made sense. Experience often removes unnecessary fears. Ethan glanced at her again. "You seem to have gained a great deal of it already." Nia looked back out the window. Life teaches quickly when it has to. Their conversation paused again, but the silence now felt comfortable rather than uncertain. Ethan realized he had not experienced a conversation like this in a very long time. Most discussions in his life revolved around numbers, strategies, and negotiations designed to maximize advantage. Talking with Nia felt different. Simpler in some ways, more honest in others. After a moment, a soft knock sounded at the door. Ethan turned slightly. "Come in." A woman in her 50s stepped inside, carrying a small tray with 2 cups of coffee. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and her posture carried the quiet professionalism of someone who had worked in the household for many years. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said warmly. Ethan nodded politely. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson." She placed the tray on the desk and turned to Nia with a gentle smile. "Miss Carter, if you need anything, please let me know. We are very happy to have you here." Nia returned the smile with equal warmth. "Thank you." Mrs. Patterson nodded once and quietly left the room. Ethan picked up one of the cups and offered the other to Nia. "Coffee." She accepted it gratefully. "Thank you." They stood together near the window, sipping quietly as the late morning light brightened the room. After a moment, Nia spoke again. "This house feels peaceful." Ethan looked around thoughtfully. "That is intentional. You do not seem like someone who enjoys chaos." Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "Chaos is expensive." Nia laughed softly at that. The sound surprised him slightly. It was the first time he had heard genuine lightness in her voice since they met. "Then perhaps this arrangement will be beneficial for both of us," she said. Ethan studied her expression carefully. "How so?" Nia set her cup gently on the windowsill. "Because I am very good at creating order when circumstances become complicated." Ethan looked at her for a moment longer and realized something unexpected. The agreement he had signed the night before was supposed to simplify a difficult situation. Yet standing here now, he sensed the opposite might be happening. Instead of simplifying his life, Nia Carter might quietly be changing it. The afternoon sunlight moved slowly across the wooden floor of the Caldwell residence, stretching golden shapes through the tall windows as the quiet rhythm of the house settled into a calm routine. Nia Carter spent the early part of the day exploring the rooms Mrs. Patterson had shown her after their coffee conversation. The house revealed itself gradually as she walked through it, not as a monument to wealth, but as a place shaped by years of careful living. There was a library on the second floor filled with books on economics, history, and engineering, shelves reaching nearly 12 feet high, with rolling ladders tucked neatly against the walls. A quiet study overlooked the garden where sunlight reflected off a small stone fountain. Even the dining room felt less like a stage for social display and more like a space where conversations mattered. Nia moved through the house slowly, absorbing details the way someone did when entering unfamiliar territory they intended to understand rather than fear. Downstairs, Ethan Caldwell sat in his private office reviewing financial reports on a tablet screen. Normally, his mornings were filled with back-to-back meetings, video calls, and strategy briefings with executives across the country. But today he had intentionally cleared the schedule. It had been years since anyone new entered his personal life, and he preferred to understand a situation fully before allowing it to unfold publicly. Yet despite his focus on the numbers glowing across the screen, his thoughts kept drifting toward the quiet presence of the woman upstairs. Nia Carter had only been in the house a few hours, and already the atmosphere felt subtly different. Not chaotic, not disruptive, simply different. A soft knock interrupted his concentration. Ethan looked up as his assistant, Laura Whitfield, stepped into the office carrying a tablet and a folder. Laura had worked with him for nearly a decade and knew his routines well enough to notice even the smallest changes in his schedule. She closed the door behind her. "I reviewed the financial transfer you requested," she said calmly. "Marcus Carter's debts have been settled completely. The bank confirmed the mortgage status this morning." Ethan nodded slightly. "Good." Laura studied his expression carefully. "Your calendar is unusually open today." Ethan set the tablet aside. "Temporary adjustment." Laura hesitated for a moment before continuing. "The board meeting tomorrow will include several new investors. They will expect updates on your long-term public strategy." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "They always do." Laura nodded and then spoke more carefully. "Rumors move quickly in our industry. If someone notices changes in your personal life, the media may become curious." Ethan's expression remained composed. "Let them be curious." Laura raised one eyebrow slightly. "You sound less concerned than usual." Ethan considered that observation for a moment. Concern rarely improves the outcome of curiosity. Laura allowed a faint smile. "Fair enough." She placed the folder on his desk and prepared to leave before pausing near the door. "The new resident seems calm." Ethan glanced toward the window. "You noticed?" Laura nodded. "Most people entering this house for the first time look overwhelmed." She did not. Ethan folded his hands together thoughtfully. "She is not easily overwhelmed." Laura studied him for a second longer, recognizing the subtle respect in his tone. "Interesting." Upstairs, Nia had discovered the library and was standing near the tall windows reading the introduction of a thick book on economic policy. The quiet scent of old paper and polished wood filled the room, creating a peaceful atmosphere that felt almost sacred. She ran her hand lightly along the spine of another book and smiled softly to herself. Opportunities often appeared in unexpected places. A few minutes later, Mrs. Patterson stepped into the doorway carrying a small tray with tea and fresh fruit. "Miss Carter, I thought you might like something light before dinner." Nia closed the book gently and turned toward her with gratitude. "That is very kind, thank you." Mrs. Patterson placed the tray on a small table near the window. "Mr. Caldwell usually works late in the afternoons. You will often have the house to yourself during that time." Nia nodded thoughtfully. "I noticed the quiet." Mrs. Patterson smiled knowingly. "It has always been a peaceful place." Nia looked around the room again. "Did he design it that way?" Mrs. Patterson folded her hands together gently. "After his parents passed away, he moved here permanently. He said he preferred a home that allowed him to think." Nia absorbed that information quietly. Thinking is valuable. Mrs. Patterson studied her expression with curiosity. "You seem very comfortable with change." Nia considered the question before answering. "Change is uncomfortable only when we resist it." Mrs. Patterson gave a small approving nod before leaving the room. Nia returned to the window with her tea and looked out over the quiet garden again. Somewhere below, she could hear faint sounds of traffic from the distant avenue, but inside the house the world felt still. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked through the hallway toward the staircase, intending to review the library himself. When he reached the doorway, he paused slightly upon seeing Nia seated near the window reading. She looked up after a moment and noticed him. "I hope I am not occupying your favorite room," she said politely. Ethan stepped inside. "It is not possible to occupy knowledge." Nia smiled faintly and closed the book carefully. "Your collection is impressive." Ethan glanced at the shelves. "Books reveal how people think." Nia nodded. "And sometimes they reveal how people change." Ethan walked slowly toward the window and looked at the title she had been reading. "Economic Development Policy," he observed. "You were not exaggerating about finishing your degree." Nia placed the book back on the shelf. "Education is the one investment no one can take away." Ethan studied her thoughtful expression. "You speak about investment as though you have been analyzing markets for years." Nia leaned lightly against the window frame. "When money is scarce, every decision becomes a financial strategy." Ethan looked at her carefully. "And now that scarcity is no longer immediate." Nia met his gaze calmly. "Now strategy becomes possibility." Ethan remained silent for a moment, absorbing the meaning behind her words. In the world he had built, most people chased wealth for comfort or status. Nia Carter seemed to value it as a tool for transformation. The difference intrigued him more than he expected. Outside, the garden leaves rustled softly as the afternoon breeze passed through the trees. The quiet house held the two of them in a moment that felt strangely balanced. Ethan finally spoke again. "Dinner will be served in an hour." Nia nodded. "I look forward to it." Ethan turned toward the door before pausing briefly. "Miss Carter." She looked up. "Yes." He considered his next words carefully. "You are adapting quickly." Nia's expression remained calm, but thoughtful. Adaptation is easier when the purpose is clear. Ethan nodded once before leaving the room. As he walked down the hallway, he realized something unexpected. The agreement he had signed only a day earlier had begun as a calculated solution to another man's problem. Yet with every passing hour, the presence of Nia Carter was quietly turning that calculation into something far more complicated than he originally imagined. Evening settled slowly over the Caldwell residence, the last streaks of sunset fading behind the tall buildings of Manhattan as warm golden light filled the dining room. The long wooden table had been set with quiet elegance, simple white plates resting on dark linen, with polished silverware reflecting the soft glow of the chandelier above. Nia Carter entered the room a few minutes after Mrs. Patterson had invited her downstairs, pausing for a moment near the doorway as she absorbed the calm atmosphere. Ethan Caldwell was already seated at the far end of the table reviewing something on a tablet, though he looked up immediately when she stepped inside. "Good evening," he said. Nia walked toward the table with composed steps. "Good evening." Mrs. Patterson appeared from the kitchen carrying 2 plates and placed them gently in front of them before stepping away again, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the tall windows, the city lights were beginning to glow across the skyline, tiny points of brightness forming a constellation over the darkening river. Ethan set the tablet aside and folded his hands loosely on the table. "I hope you had time to explore the house," he said. Nia nodded. "It is larger than any place I have lived in, but it does not feel overwhelming." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "Most people describe it that way." Nia lifted her glass of water and took a small sip before answering. "Size only becomes overwhelming when a person feels they do not belong in the space." Ethan studied her for a moment. "And you feel you belong?" Nia set the glass down again. "I feel I am learning how to exist here." Ethan allowed a faint smile. "That is a practical answer." Dinner was served quietly by Mrs. Patterson and another staff member, the gentle sound of dishes and soft footsteps blending with the calm rhythm of the evening. The meal itself was simple but carefully prepared, roasted vegetables and grilled salmon accompanied by warm bread. Nia noticed that Ethan ate slowly, not distracted by his phone or work, which surprised her slightly. Many of the successful professionals she had encountered during part-time jobs seemed unable to pause even during a meal. After several minutes, Ethan spoke again. "Tomorrow will be different from today," he said calmly. Nia looked up. "How so?" "The board of Caldwell Dynamics will meet in the morning. Several investors from California will attend." Nia nodded thoughtfully. "And I assume my presence will eventually become relevant." Ethan appreciated the directness of her observation. "Yes." Nia did not appear concerned. Instead, she asked, "Will they know about our arrangement immediately?" Ethan shook his head slightly. "Not yet. For now, you are simply a private guest in my home." Nia considered that for a moment while cutting a small piece of salmon. Eventually, curiosity will lead them to ask questions. Ethan nodded once. "It usually does." Nia looked across the table at him carefully. "Does secrecy make your life easier?" Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "Sometimes. But secrecy also creates speculation." Nia gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Speculation often becomes louder than truth." Ethan studied her expression again. The way she approached conversation reminded him less of casual social talk and more of strategic thinking. It was subtle, but he noticed it every time she responded. After a moment, he asked, "What did you enjoy most about your studies?" Nia paused before answering, clearly considering the question seriously. "Understanding systems," she said. "Businesses, governments, communities. Everything operates through patterns of decision and consequence." Ethan seemed intrigued. "And what did you learn from observing those patterns?" Nia placed her fork down carefully. "That small decisions made by powerful people can reshape entire lives." The remark hung in the air for a moment longer than either of them expected. Ethan understood immediately that she was not speaking about theory alone. She was speaking about the decision that had brought her into this house. He accepted the weight of that truth without defensiveness. That observation is accurate, he said quietly. Nia met his gaze without accusation. Power is rarely neutral. Ethan nodded slowly. No, it is not. The room grew quiet again as they continued eating. Outside, the sky had darkened completely, the reflections of city lights dancing faintly across the glass windows. After a few minutes, Ethan spoke again, his tone slightly more reflective than before. My parents built their company from a small engineering firm, he said. They worked 16 hours a day when I was a child. Nia listened attentively. That must have shaped your understanding of success. Ethan nodded. It did. They believed work created stability. Nia tilted her head slightly. And do you believe the same thing? Ethan considered the question carefully. I believe work creates opportunity. Stability is something different. Nia leaned slightly forward with interest. How so? Ethan looked toward the window for a moment before answering. Opportunity gives a person choices. Stability requires wisdom to choose correctly. Nia smiled faintly at that. Then perhaps wisdom is the more valuable asset. Ethan looked back at her. Perhaps. Their conversation paused again, but the silence felt thoughtful rather than awkward. After dinner, Mrs. Patterson cleared the table and left them with 2 cups of tea near the window. Ethan stood and walked toward the glass overlooking the garden. Nia joined him a moment later, standing a few feet away as they both looked out at the quiet trees moving gently in the evening air. Your brother must be relieved tonight, Ethan said after a moment. Nia nodded. Daniel believes the future has already improved. Ethan glanced at her. And you? Nia considered the question for several seconds. I believe the future has become possible. Ethan found the distinction interesting. Possible but uncertain. Nia smiled softly. All worthwhile futures are uncertain. Ethan leaned one shoulder lightly against the window frame. You do not seem intimidated by uncertainty. Nia looked out toward the dark sky above the garden. Uncertainty is the natural condition of life. People only pretend they control it. Ethan watched her quietly. Something about the calm clarity in her perspective felt both unusual and refreshing. After a moment he said, You adapt quickly. Nia turned slightly toward him. Adapting is not difficult when the purpose is clear. Ethan nodded once, remembering the same words she had spoken earlier that day. For a moment neither of them spoke. The quiet garden outside reflected faint light from the house, creating gentle shadows on the stone path. Finally Ethan spoke again, his voice softer than usual. I expected this arrangement to feel very different. Nia raised an eyebrow slightly. Different in what way? Ethan looked out toward the city skyline in the distance. More transactional. Nia considered that carefully before responding. Perhaps it still is. Ethan glanced at her again. And yet, Nia finished the thought for him with a calm voice. Sometimes transactions become the beginning of something more complicated. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the quiet garden and realized she was probably right. What had begun as a calculated solution to another man's debt was slowly evolving into a relationship neither of them had fully anticipated. And although he had built his entire career around predicting outcomes, for the first time in a very long time Ethan Caldwell found himself stepping into a future he could not completely calculate. Morning came earlier than expected inside the Caldwell residence. Sunlight slipped through the tall curtains of Nia Carter's bedroom, painting soft lines of gold across the quiet wooden floor. For a moment she remained still beneath the blankets, listening to the unfamiliar silence of a house that was far larger than the one she had left behind in Newark. The quiet here was different. It did not carry the distant sound of neighbors arguing through thin walls or buses braking outside the street corner. It carried space, and space gave a person room to think. Nia slowly sat up and looked toward the window where the city skyline shimmered faintly in the early light. Only 2 days had passed since she stepped into Ethan Caldwell's world, yet time already felt stretched between 2 different realities. Downstairs, the calm rhythm of the household had already begun. Mrs. Patterson moved through the kitchen preparing breakfast while the faint scent of fresh coffee drifted up through the hallway. Nia dressed simply in dark slacks and a soft cream blouse before walking downstairs. When she entered the dining room, she saw Ethan already seated near the window, reviewing several printed documents spread neatly across the table. He looked up as she approached. "Good morning." His voice carried the same calm steadiness she had noticed since the first night they met. Nia took a seat across from him. "Good morning." Mrs. Patterson placed a cup of coffee beside Nia and gave her a warm smile before returning to the kitchen. Outside the window, the city was waking. Slowly, sunlight glinting off the glass towers across the river. Ethan gathered the papers together and set them aside. "Today will be busy," he said. Nia looked at him curiously. "The board meeting." Ethan nodded once. "Yes." She folded her hands around the warm coffee cup. "Will you be at the office all day?" "Most of it." He paused briefly before adding, "But there is something you should know before I leave." Nia waited. Ethan leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table. "One of the investors attending today has a habit of investigating people connected to business partners." Nia understood immediately, "Meaning he may learn about me." Ethan did not attempt to soften the truth. "Possibly." Nia took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "And when that happens?" Ethan studied her expression carefully. "Then the situation becomes public sooner than expected." Nia nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the information with the same composed calm she had shown since arriving. "Does that create a problem for you?" Ethan answered honestly. "It creates a tension." Nia set the cup down gently. "A tension can be managed." Ethan raised one eyebrow slightly. "You say that with a great deal of confidence." Nia met his gaze calmly. "Confidence is simply preparation meeting opportunity." Ethan watched her for a moment longer than usual. The woman sitting across from him did not speak like someone overwhelmed by sudden wealth or status. She spoke like someone analyzing a complex system and quietly calculating where she stood inside it. After breakfast, Ethan left for his office downtown. The house returned to its quiet rhythm as Nia spent the morning in the library reviewing university enrollment programs. She had already emailed 2 schools about transferring her previous coursework and finishing the final year of her degree. The idea of returning to structured education felt grounding after the whirlwind of the past week. Around noon, Mrs. Patterson entered the library with a small envelope. "Miss Carter, this arrived for you." Nia accepted it with curiosity. There was no return address, only her name written neatly on the front. She opened it carefully and unfolded the letter inside. The message was short but direct. "Welcome to the Caldwell world. People are already talking about you. Be careful who you trust." Nia read the note twice before folding it again. Mrs. Patterson watched her expression with quiet concern. "Is everything all right?" Nia placed the letter back in the envelope. "Just curiosity from someone who prefers to stay anonymous." Mrs. Patterson frowned slightly. "Should Mr. Caldwell know about it?" Nia considered that for a moment before answering calmly. "Yes, but it is not urgent." She slipped the envelope into her bag and returned to the books on the table. Several hours later, Ethan returned to the house earlier than expected. The moment he stepped through the front door, he sensed something different in the air. Not tension exactly, but the quiet awareness that something had shifted during his absence. Mrs. Patterson met him in the hallway. "Miss Carter is in the library." Ethan nodded and walked upstairs. When he entered the room, he saw Nia sitting near the window with several open textbooks spread across the table. She looked up immediately. "You are back early." Ethan closed the door behind him. The board meeting finished sooner than planned. He studied her expression carefully. Did anything unusual happen today? Nia reached into her bag and handed him the envelope. Ethan read the message silently, his expression growing slightly more serious as he finished. "Someone inside the investor group must already suspect something," he said quietly. Nia leaned back in her chair. "That was my first thought." Ethan folded the paper slowly. "Are you concerned?" Nia shook her head. "Concern does not improve strategy." Ethan almost smiled at that. "You are remarkably calm about anonymous warnings." Nia looked toward the garden outside the window. People who send messages like this usually hope fear will influence decisions. She turned back toward him. "I prefer not to reward that strategy." Ethan studied her thoughtfully. "You are adjusting to this world very quickly." Nia closed the book in front of her. "I told you before. Adaptation becomes easier when the purpose is clear." Ethan rested the envelope on the table. "And what purpose guides you right now?" Nia answered without hesitation. "Turning uncertainty into opportunity." Ethan remained silent for a moment, absorbing the clarity of that answer. The truth was simple. He had expected this arrangement to protect his reputation while solving a financial problem for her family. Instead, it was becoming something far more unpredictable, because the woman standing in front of him was not merely surviving inside his world. She was learning how to navigate it. The evening air inside the Caldwell residence carried a different kind of tension after Ethan finished reading the anonymous message. It was not the loud tension of conflict or anger. It was the quiet awareness that the private world they had been building inside the walls of the townhouse might not remain private for long. Ethan stood beside the large table in the library, the folded notes still resting between his fingers, while Nia Carter remained seated near the window with the calm posture she had shown since the beginning of their unusual arrangement. Outside, the garden lights had already turned on, casting warm circles of light across the stone path and reflecting softly against the tall windows. Ethan finally placed the note back on the table. "Someone is watching the situation more closely than expected," he said. Nia nodded once. Curiosity spreads quickly in environments where influence and money intersect. Ethan studied her expression. Most people would be unsettled by a message like that. Nia leaned slightly back in her chair. Most people expect safety from privacy. I never had that luxury. Ethan could not deny the truth in her statement. For years he had built walls around his personal life, believing privacy was something wealth could secure. Yet the business world often proved otherwise. If the investors begin asking questions, he said slowly, the story could travel beyond the boardroom. Nia folded her hands together thoughtfully. Stories always travel. Ethan walked slowly toward the window, looking out over the quiet garden as he considered the situation. "The problem is not the story itself," he said. "It is the interpretation." Nia stood and joined him beside the glass. "Interpretation depends on who tells the story first." Ethan turned slightly toward her. "You believe we should control the narrative." Nia met his gaze calmly. "I believe every situation already contains a narrative. The only choice is whether you shape it or react to it." Ethan allowed a small smile. "You sound like a strategist." Nia shrugged lightly. "Growing up with limited options forces people to think strategically." Ethan looked at her for a moment longer before speaking again. "Tomorrow evening, I am attending a reception with several of the same investors from the board meeting." Nia listened carefully. "And you expect questions?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." Nia considered that quietly. Then perhaps the reception is the moment to introduce clarity rather than avoid it. Ethan studied her with interest. "You would attend with me?" Nia did not hesitate. If the purpose is to remove speculation, then appearing together would accomplish that. Ethan rested his hand lightly against the window frame. That would make the situation public immediately. Nia's expression remained steady. "The message we received suggests the situation may already be public in certain circles." Ethan could not argue with that logic. Silence settled between them again for a moment as both of them considered the implications. Finally, Ethan spoke. "You understand what a public appearance means?" Nia nodded. "People will watch carefully. They will also judge." Nia's response was calm. "Judgment is unavoidable when wealth and reputation are involved." Ethan studied her closely. "And you are prepared for that?" Nia looked out toward the garden lights. "Preparation does not remove judgment, but it allows a person to stand calmly in front of it." Ethan realized then that she was not merely agreeing to attend the event for his benefit. She was stepping deliberately into the center of the situation with clear awareness of what it might bring. That level of composure impressed him more than he expected. Later that evening, they moved to the sitting room, where soft lamps illuminated the quiet space with warm light. Ethan poured 2 cups of tea while Nia reviewed a few notes she had written earlier about her university applications. The simple act of planning for her future seemed to ground her in a way that balanced the uncertainty surrounding their arrangement. Ethan handed her the tea and sat across from her. "What were you studying earlier today?" Nia glanced at the notebook in her lap. "Market development strategies." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "You choose very ambitious subjects." Nia smiled faintly. "Ambition often begins with education." Ethan studied her thoughtfully. "You believe knowledge creates independence." Nia nodded. "Independence is the only reliable form of security." Ethan looked toward the window again. "Many people in my world measure security through wealth." Nia closed the notebook. "Wealth can disappear. Skills rarely do." Ethan could not argue with that. The quiet wisdom behind her perspective reminded him again how different her life experiences had been from the people who usually surrounded him. After a moment, he spoke again. If you attend the reception tomorrow evening, you will meet people who have spent decades protecting their influence. Nia listened carefully. And they will expect me to feel intimidated. Ethan allowed a small smile. That is usually how these situations unfold. Nia returned the smile calmly. Then it will be interesting to disappoint their expectations. Ethan found himself laughing softly at that remark. The sound surprised him slightly because genuine laughter had become rare in the structured environment of his professional life. The evening continued quietly as they discussed the logistics of the upcoming reception. Ethan explained the structure of the event, the types of questions investors often asked, and the subtle social cues that govern conversations among people accustomed to power. Nia listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that revealed her ability to analyze unfamiliar environments quickly. By the time the conversation ended, both of them understood something important. The anonymous letter had not created fear inside the house. Instead, it had accelerated a decision that might have happened weeks later. As the night grew deeper and the lights of the city shimmered beyond the windows, Ethan stood near the doorway of the sitting room. Tomorrow evening will change how people see this situation, he said quietly. Nia rose from her chair and met his gaze with calm certainty. People will see what we allow them to see. Ethan studied her expression one more time before nodding slowly. For the first time since the anonymous message arrived, he felt something close to confidence rather than concern. Because if the world outside his walls was already watching, then perhaps the best response was not to hide the truth, but to present it with the same calm clarity Nia Carter had shown since the moment she entered his life. The next evening arrived with a quiet sense of anticipation inside the Caldwell residence. The city outside glowed with early evening lights as Manhattan prepared for another night of conversations, negotiations, and carefully managed appearances. Nia Carter stood in front of the tall mirror in her room, adjusting the sleeve of a deep navy dress Mrs. Patterson had helped her choose earlier that afternoon. The dress was elegant but simple, designed more for confidence than spectacle. She had learned quickly that in environments filled with powerful people, restraint often carried more authority than excess. A soft knock sounded on the door before Ethan Caldwell stepped inside. He wore a dark tailored suit with the composed confidence of someone accustomed to entering rooms where decisions worth millions of dollars were made. For a moment he paused near the doorway, studying her reflection in the mirror with quiet approval. "You look prepared," he said. Nia turned slightly toward him. "Prepared is the goal." Ethan nodded once. The reception will be held on the 35th floor of the Lexington Financial Center. Several investors, executives, and media analysts will attend. Nia listened calmly. So curiosity will be present. Ethan allowed a faint smile. Curiosity is always present when investors gather. A few minutes later, the black sedan waited outside the townhouse, its engine humming quietly beneath the streetlights. As the car moved through the evening traffic toward Midtown Manhattan, the city unfolded around them in bright reflections of glass towers and crowded sidewalks. Nia watched the passing streets thoughtfully, while Ethan reviewed a few final notes on his phone. Neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with unnecessary conversation. The quiet carried focus rather than tension. When the car stopped in front of the Lexington Financial Center, the entrance was already illuminated with soft golden lighting. Uniformed attendants guided arriving guests toward the elevators, while security staff managed the steady flow of executives entering the building. Ethan stepped out first and offered his hand to Nia as she exited the car. Cameras were not visible yet, but Nia could already feel the subtle shift in attention as nearby guests recognized the billionaire stepping onto the sidewalk. They entered the lobby together where the polished marble floors reflected the lights of the tall atrium above. The private elevator carried them smoothly to the reception floor where the doors opened into a large glass-walled lounge overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Conversations filled the air in quiet waves of laughter, negotiation, and polite introductions. A jazz quartet played softly near the far corner of the room, adding a calm rhythm to the evening atmosphere. The moment Ethan stepped inside, several guests turned to greet him. "Ethan Caldwell," one investor said warmly as he approached with a handshake. "Good to see you again." Ethan returned the greeting easily. "Good evening, Jonathan." Jonathan's eyes shifted toward Nia with immediate curiosity. "And who is your guest tonight?" Ethan did not hesitate. "This is Nia Carter." Nia extended her hand politely. It is a pleasure to meet you. Jonathan shook her hand and nodded politely before moving aside as more guests approached. Within minutes, the subtle pattern of attention began to form around them. People greeted Ethan warmly, but their eyes always returned to Nia, measuring, observing, calculating what her presence meant. Nia remained calm, responding to introductions with composed confidence. She asked thoughtful questions when people mentioned their companies and listened carefully when conversations shifted toward business strategy. Ethan noticed the reactions immediately. Several investors who normally spoke to him with polished confidence seemed slightly surprised by the intelligence in her responses. At one point, a technology executive named Robert Mitchell approached them holding a glass of wine. "Ethan, I heard about your latest expansion into renewable engineering," he said before turning his attention toward Nia. "And you are?" "Nia Carter," she said calmly. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "Do you work in the industry?" Nia smiled slightly. "Not yet, but I am studying business development and economic strategy." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "Ambitious," Nia answered without hesitation. "Opportunity usually favors preparation." Ethan noticed the subtle shift in Mitchell's expression. The comment had earned respect rather than dismissal. As the evening continued, more conversations unfolded. Several investors asked about market forecasts, others discussed global supply chains, and a few simply enjoyed the social aspect of the gathering. But throughout the room, the quiet question remained visible in the way people glanced toward Ethan and Nia together. Eventually, one of the senior partners from the investment group approached them with a direct tone. "Ethan, the board mentioned you might be making changes in your personal life." The surrounding conversation softened slightly as nearby guests listened discreetly. Ethan remained completely calm. "People often speculate about changes," he said. The partner nodded. "Yes, they do." His eyes shifted briefly toward Nia. Nia recognized the moment instantly. The reception had reached the point where speculation would either expand or be resolved. She stepped slightly closer to Ethan, her voice calm but clear enough to carry across the immediate circle of guests. "Speculation usually grows in silence," she said. "Clarity is often more efficient." Several people looked toward her with renewed interest. Ethan studied her expression for a brief second before understanding her intention. He turned to the group calmly. "Miss Carter and I are working together on several long-term initiatives," he said. "Her insights into development strategy have been valuable." The statement was technically accurate while allowing the situation to remain dignified. The senior partner nodded slowly. "That explains the curiosity," Nia added gently. "Curiosity is natural when people encounter something new." The tension in the conversation dissolved almost immediately. Guests began discussing other topics again, while the earlier speculation faded into respectful interest rather than rumor. Ethan glanced toward Nia with quiet approval. She had navigated the moment with remarkable composure. Later in the evening, they moved toward the glass balcony overlooking the city. The skyline stretched endlessly across the horizon, lights shimmering across the river below. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the railing. "You handled that moment very well," he said quietly. Nia looked out at the city lights. "Situations like that require calm." Ethan nodded once. "Most people in your position would have felt intimidated." Nia shook her head slightly. "Intimidation only exists when someone believes another person holds more value." Ethan studied her thoughtful expression. "And you do not believe that?" Nia met his gaze calmly. "Value is not determined by wealth or reputation. It is determined by character and purpose." Ethan remained silent for a moment as the wind moved gently across the balcony. Inside the reception, the music continued softly while conversations resumed around them. Finally, he spoke again. "Tonight was supposed to protect a private arrangement from rumor." Nia smiled faintly. Instead, it introduced a new narrative. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes." He looked out at the glowing city again, realizing something unexpected had happened. What began as a calculated attempt to control speculation had quietly transformed into something more powerful. The investors inside the room no longer saw Nia Carter as a mysterious presence beside him. They saw her as someone capable of standing confidently in the same room, where influence and reputation usually determined every conversation. The reception continued long after the first wave of speculation faded into ordinary conversation. Inside the glass-walled lounge, the skyline shimmered beyond the windows while investors and executives moved through the room exchanging opinions about markets, technology, and global trends. Yet even as the music played softly in the background and waiters carried trays of drinks between groups of guests, one quiet shift had already taken place. People were no longer simply noticing Nia Carter. They were beginning to listen to her. Ethan Caldwell observed it gradually as the evening unfolded. At first, the attention had been cautious curiosity, the type reserved for someone who appeared suddenly beside a man whose life was normally private. But after several conversations, the curiosity had changed into something more respectful. Investors who usually spoke only to Ethan were now directing questions toward Nia as well. At one point, a venture partner named David Lang approached them while reviewing several figures on his tablet. "Mr. Caldwell," he said politely before glancing toward Nia. "Miss Carter, I heard you were studying development economics." Nia nodded calmly. "Yes." Lang looked intrigued. "Then perhaps you have an opinion about the infrastructure proposal being discussed in Washington this year." Ethan watched quietly as Nia responded. "The proposal focuses heavily on transportation upgrades," she said. "But long-term growth usually depends on education access and technology investment. Infrastructure helps movement. Education helps transformation." Lang raised his eyebrows slightly. "That is a very balanced perspective." Nia smiled politely. Balanced systems usually produce stronger outcomes. The conversation lasted several minutes longer as other guests joined in. Ethan noticed how naturally she handled the discussion. She did not attempt to dominate the conversation, but every time she spoke, the room seemed to pause for a moment. Her words were measured and thoughtful, never exaggerated, never defensive. When Lang eventually moved on, Ethan turned toward her with quiet approval. "You handled that conversation well." Nia looked toward the skyline beyond the glass wall. People often assume someone new to a room will speak carelessly. Listening carefully first changes that expectation. Ethan allowed a small smile. "You understand social dynamics very quickly." Nia shrugged lightly. "Observation is the most valuable skill in unfamiliar environments." A few minutes later, another group approached them near the balcony. Among them was Jonathan Pierce, one of the senior investors who had greeted Ethan earlier that evening. His tone was friendly but curious. "Ethan, several people have been asking how you and Miss Carter met." The surrounding guests grew quiet again, not rudely, but with the natural interest that followed any question connected to someone of Ethan's reputation. Ethan glanced briefly toward Nia before answering. "Circumstances brought us together unexpectedly," he said calmly. Jonathan studied them both for a moment before smiling politely. "Unexpected circumstances often produce interesting partnerships." Nia responded before Ethan could add anything. Partnerships usually begin when two people recognize opportunity in the same moment. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "Well said." The brief exchange seemed to satisfy the curiosity in the group, and the conversation moved on to other subjects. But Ethan noticed something important. Nia had answered the question without revealing anything private while still maintaining dignity and clarity. She was not hiding behind him, yet she was not exposing the arrangement either. It was a delicate balance, and she handled it naturally. Later in the evening, the reception began to quiet as several guests prepared to leave. The jazz quartet finished its final song, and the city lights outside had deepened into the brilliant patterns of midnight Manhattan. Ethan and Nia stepped out onto the balcony again, where the cool night air carried the distant sounds of traffic far below. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The skyline stretched endlessly in front of them, glowing with the quiet power of a city that never truly slept. Ethan finally broke the silence. Tonight changed several assumptions. Nia leaned lightly against the railing. "Which assumptions?" Ethan looked toward the glass doors behind them where the remaining investors were finishing their conversations. "Some people expected you to feel overwhelmed in that room." Nia smiled faintly. "Expectations are often based on incomplete information." Ethan nodded. "You exceeded their expectations." Nia turned slightly toward him. "I simply answered questions honestly." Ethan studied her expression thoughtfully. Honesty is not always the easiest strategy in environments like that. Nia looked out over the city again. The alternative usually creates more problems later. Ethan could not argue with that. He rested his hands on the railing, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers. "When I first signed our agreement, I believed it would simplify a complicated situation," he said quietly. Nia listened without interrupting. Instead, he continued, the situation has become more complex. Nia tilted her head slightly. Complexity is not always negative. Ethan looked at her with curiosity. How so? Nia answered calmly. Complex systems create more possibilities. Ethan laughed softly at that observation. You see opportunity in everything. Nia met his gaze with quiet certainty. Opportunity exists in everything. The question is whether someone recognizes it. For a moment, they stood there together looking out over the city lights. Inside the reception, the final guests were beginning to leave, their voices fading into the quiet rhythm of the building. Ethan finally spoke again. You realize something important tonight. Nia waited. People in that room respect intelligence, he said. You showed them that. Nia nodded thoughtfully. Respect is often earned through calm confidence. Ethan studied her expression one more time before they returned inside to collect their coats. As they walked toward the elevator, several investors nodded politely in farewell. But the looks they gave Nia were no longer filled with curiosity alone. They carried recognition as well. When the elevator doors closed and began descending toward the lobby, Ethan turned toward her. Tonight we'll travel through conversations tomorrow morning, he said. Nia nodded calmly. Stories move quickly in powerful circles. Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. And the story tonight was different from what many people expected. Nia smiled slightly as the elevator continued its quiet descent through the tower. Then perhaps the narrative has already begun to change. The drive back to the Caldwell residence was quiet, but it was not the same quiet that had existed before the reception. The city outside the car window moved in bright ribbons of light as midnight traffic flowed through Manhattan's avenues. Nia Carter watched the reflections of streetlights pass across the glass, while Ethan Caldwell sat beside her reviewing several messages that had already begun arriving on his phone. News traveled quickly in circles where influence and money intersected, and the reception had already sparked conversations across several financial networks. Ethan finally set the phone down and looked toward her. It has begun, he said calmly. Nia turned her head slightly. The conversations. Ethan nodded once. Several investors have already sent messages asking about you. Nia considered that quietly. Curiosity travels faster than truth. Ethan allowed a faint smile. That is why clarity matters. The car turned onto the quiet street where the townhouse stood waiting beneath the soft glow of street lamps. When they stepped inside the house, Mrs. Patterson had left a small tray of tea in the sitting room, anticipating their return. The house felt peaceful again after the intensity of the reception, as if the walls themselves protected the quiet life inside from the loud speculation forming outside. Ethan removed his jacket and placed it carefully over the back of a chair before pouring 2 cups of tea. Nia sat near the window looking out toward the dark garden where the fountain continued its gentle rhythm. Tonight was interesting, she said thoughtfully. Ethan handed her the cup. Interesting is one way to describe it. Nia smiled faintly. Successful might be another. Ethan studied her expression. You believe it was successful? Nia nodded. People expected uncertainty. Instead, they saw confidence. Ethan leaned slightly against the table. Confidence can change perception quickly. Nia took a small sip of tea. Perception often shapes opportunity. Ethan remained quiet for a moment before speaking again. There is something you should understand about the people in that room. Nia waited. Many of them have spent their lives evaluating risk. When they meet someone new, they immediately measure whether that person adds value or creates uncertainty. Nia listened carefully. And tonight? Ethan looked directly at her. Tonight they decided you add value. Nia considered that statement thoughtfully. Then the narrative has already shifted. Ethan nodded slowly. Yes. The next morning the effect of the reception became visible immediately. When Ethan arrived at his office, several executives greeted him with the usual professional respect, but their tone carried an undercurrent of curiosity. A few asked politely about the woman who had attended the reception with him. Others simply observed quietly, waiting to see how the situation would develop. Meanwhile, Nia remained at the townhouse reviewing university application forms and financial development reports she had borrowed from the library. The quiet environment allowed her to focus, but she could still feel the invisible shift happening outside the walls. Around midday, Laura Whitfield called the house phone. Mrs. Patterson answered and then passed the receiver to Nia. Miss Carter, Mr. Caldwell's assistant, is on the line. Nia lifted the phone. Hello. Laura's voice sounded calm, but curious. Miss Carter, I wanted to inform you that several journalists contacted the company this morning asking whether you are working with Mr. Caldwell on new development initiatives. Nia considered the information calmly. What did you tell them? That Mr. Caldwell's personal partnerships are private matters. Nia smiled slightly. A diplomatic response. Laura hesitated before asking another question. If you do not mind me asking, are you prepared for this level of attention? Nia answered honestly. Attention is easier to manage than uncertainty. Laura paused for a moment, as if considering that response. I see why Mr. Caldwell values your perspective. After the call ended, Nia returned to the library where sunlight streamed through the tall windows. She opened one of the economic policy books again, but found her thoughts drifting toward the events of the previous evening. The reception had not simply introduced her to Ethan's professional world. It had also revealed something about the man himself. Ethan Caldwell moved through powerful environments with calm discipline, but there was something quieter beneath that control, something thoughtful, something that had allowed him to treat her with dignity from the very beginning. Late that afternoon, Ethan returned home earlier than usual. When he entered the library, he found Nia seated at the large table, surrounded by books and notes. She looked up with a small smile. Busy day? Ethan nodded as he sat across from her. Several investors requested meetings after the reception. Nia closed one of the books. That is a positive signal. Ethan looked at her carefully. They are interested in hearing your ideas. Nia raised an eyebrow slightly. My ideas? Ethan nodded. The conversation you had about development strategy caught their attention. Nia leaned back thoughtfully. Then the reception created more opportunity than speculation. Ethan smiled faintly. Exactly. For a moment, they sat quietly as the late afternoon sunlight moved slowly across the table. Ethan finally spoke again. There is a conference next month focused on infrastructure and technology investment. Nia listened attentively. And you believe I should attend? Ethan nodded once. Yes. Nia considered the idea carefully. That would place me directly inside the industry conversations. Ethan leaned forward slightly. You belong in those conversations. Nia studied his expression for a moment before answering softly. That is a very generous statement. Ethan shook his head slightly. It is an accurate one. Outside the window, the garden leaves moved gently in the afternoon breeze while the quiet house held their conversation like a moment suspended between two worlds. Nia realized then that the agreement she had signed weeks earlier had already begun transforming into something more meaningful than either of them had predicted. Because what had started as a financial solution for her family was slowly evolving into a partnership built on mutual respect and shared vision. And as she looked across the table at Ethan Caldwell, she understood something important. The most unexpected part of this journey was not the attention from investors or journalists. It was the quiet realization that the man who had once seemed like a distant figure of power was gradually becoming someone she trusted. The following weeks moved forward with a rhythm that felt both new and strangely natural inside the Caldwell residence. What had once been a carefully structured agreement written in legal language had gradually transformed into a daily routine shaped by quiet respect and shared purpose. Nia Carter spent most mornings in the library continuing her studies, reviewing economic policy, development strategy, and infrastructure planning while preparing for the final year of her business degree. The large wooden table by the window had slowly become her workspace, filled with notebooks, research articles, and the occasional handwritten outline of ideas she hoped to explore in the future. Meanwhile, Ethan Caldwell returned each evening from the office with updates from the growing number of investors who had become interested in the ideas Nia had shared during the reception. What surprised him most was not the curiosity itself, but the tone of it. The conversations were not dismissive or skeptical. They were serious. Several executives had begun asking whether she might participate in strategic discussions during upcoming conferences. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after the reception, Ethan entered the library to find Nia reviewing a series of development proposals spread across the table. She looked up as he stepped inside. You are home earlier than usual, she said. Ethan nodded while placing his briefcase near the chair. The meeting ended sooner than expected. He walked over to the table and glanced at the paper she had been studying. What are you working on? Nia slid one of the documents toward him. An infrastructure initiative for several mid-sized cities in the Midwest. The concept focuses on combining transportation improvements with education investment. Ethan read the first page quietly before looking up again. This is thoughtful work. Nia smiled slightly. It is only an outline. Ethan leaned against the table thoughtfully. You realize this idea could attract serious attention. Nia nodded. Possibly. Ethan studied her expression carefully. You say that as though attention does not interest you. Nia closed one of the notebooks beside her. Attention is useful only if it leads to meaningful change. Ethan considered that quietly before responding. Tomorrow morning, I have a conference call with 3 of the investors you met at the reception. Nia waited. They asked if you would be willing to join the conversation. Nia blinked once in surprise before regaining her calm composure. They want to hear my perspective. Ethan nodded. Yes. Nia sat back slowly in her chair, absorbing the significance of the moment. Weeks earlier, she had entered the Caldwell residence as part of an agreement created to solve her father's financial crisis. Now she was being invited into conversations that could influence real investment decisions across multiple cities. I would be honored to participate, she said finally. Ethan smiled faintly. I thought you might say that. The following morning, the conference call began promptly at 9 o'clock. Ethan sat at his desk in the study while Nia joined him across the table with her notes carefully organized beside her. The investors appeared on the large screen mounted on the wall, their offices visible behind them in cities ranging from San Francisco to Chicago. After several minutes of discussion about market trends and development strategies, one of the investors turned toward Nia with a thoughtful expression. Miss Carter, Ethan mentioned that you have been researching regional infrastructure models. We would be interested to hear your thoughts. Nia spoke calmly, explaining the importance of connecting education funding with transportation planning and technology investment. Her ideas were clear and practical, focusing not only on economic growth, but also on long-term community stability. As the conversation continued, the investors asked more questions, exploring the details of her proposals with increasing interest. By the end of the call, one of them leaned forward slightly toward the camera. Miss Carter, if you are willing, we would like you to present these ideas at the development conference next month. The room grew quiet for a moment. Nia looked toward Ethan briefly before answering. I would be happy to contribute. After the call ended, Ethan remained seated for several seconds before speaking. That was impressive. Nia smiled softly. It was a good conversation. Ethan leaned back in his chair. You handled it with remarkable confidence. Nia glanced toward the window where the garden fountain reflected the morning sunlight. Confidence grows when a person believes their voice matters. Ethan studied her thoughtfully. Your voice does matter. For the rest of the day, Nia worked quietly in the library, while Ethan returned to the office for additional meetings. When he arrived home, that evening the house felt peaceful as always. Mrs. Patterson had prepared dinner, and the soft sound of music played faintly from the sitting room. After dinner, Ethan and Nia stepped out into the garden, where the night air carried the gentle scent of blooming flowers. The small fountain continued its quiet rhythm, while city lights glowed beyond the tall brick walls surrounding the property. Ethan walked slowly along the stone path, before stopping near the center of the garden. There is something I have been thinking about, he said quietly. Nia turned toward him. What is that? Ethan took a moment before answering. When your father first came to me with his problem, I believed money could solve it. Nia listened carefully. And it did solve part of it. Ethan nodded slowly. Yes. But what I did not expect was how much this situation would change my perspective. Nia watched him thoughtfully. In what way? Ethan looked toward the quiet garden lights. I built my entire career believing success came from controlling outcomes. But meeting you showed me that sometimes the most important changes happen when you allow something unexpected to unfold. Nia considered his words before responding. Unexpected paths often reveal the most meaningful destinations. Ethan smiled faintly. You have a way of turning complicated ideas into simple truths. Nia returned the smile gently. Simple truths are often the most powerful. They stood quietly together for a moment beneath the soft glow of the garden lights. The fountain continued its gentle rhythm, while the distant sounds of the city reminded them that the world outside continued moving at its usual relentless pace. Ethan finally spoke again. Your father believed he was solving a problem when he made that agreement with me. Nia nodded slowly. Yes. Ethan looked at her with calm sincerity. But what he truly did was open a door neither of us expected. Nia's eyes reflected the soft garden lights as she answered quietly. Sometimes the most difficult decisions become the beginning of something better. Ethan nodded once, understanding the truth behind her words. Because the arrangement that had once been written as a simple transaction had slowly transformed into something far more meaningful. Not just an agreement between two people from different worlds, but a partnership built on trust, respect, and the shared belief that opportunity could change a life.